And what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight Meredith and David. So Meredith, it's all yours.
Hi, everybody. Greetings from southwestern France, where it's 7:30 at night. I'm really delighted to introduce David tonight. I've known David since I think I was about 7 years old. And we reconnected in Manhattan, where we were both working once upon a time. David was a senior editor at Fortune magazine, specializing in technology and business. And I was at ABC News. David is now passionate about climate change and how we're going to address it. And that's what we're focusing on tonight. I just should say he founded and he's CEO of a company called Techonomy about 12 years ago. And that was exploring the intersection between technology and the economy. And they facilitated all kinds of conferences. So he's very plugged into the business world. And I'm interested to find out what he thinks about the business world. Are they getting on board with green technology? I put David's bio in the chat box. If you want more information, it's there. So David, adjusting your lighting. Are you in Manhattan?
Sorry, I was just adjusting my circumstances. I am in Manhattan, yes.
Yeah.
I'm in my apartment on 14th Street, and I was trying to get a little bit better background. I think you can see me okay, can't you?
Yeah.
Is that all right?
Yep, it's
Not
good.
maybe the perfect Zoom lighting situation, but if it's adequate, I appreciate your patience, your indulgence, shall I say. So, yes,
So
I have very few relatives, but you're one of them, Meredith, as we call you.
We're related somehow. So you're leaving Techonomy, which you've been CEO of, and during that time, you've run all these conferences. You've been to Davos, where you've hosted conferences and panels. I think you're leaving to work on climate issues, but can you talk about that?
Yeah, thanks. Well, Techonomy was a company that I started 12 years ago, and I did leave at the end of December. And what it was a conference and media company focused on how technology alters progress. And it was founded on a very fundamentally optimistic set of presumptions, and really spent all of our time for those 12 years, probably over 30 conferences and a heck of a lot of articles and videos, et cetera, trying to help people understand how this incredibly rapidly changing environment we live in which technology is affecting more and more ways, in which we live, more and more aspects of our lives and the ways we do business, how that can be most harnessed in a beneficial fashion. That's kind of been the central thrust of the whole thing, which is obviously extremely broad and wide-ranging. But in recent years, technology and climate, in my opinion, are converging in an extremely positive and critical way. We've been doing a number of programs in the last couple of years at Techonomy about climate tech and climate action in various respects. We had an entire Techonomy climate conference last March in Mountain View. And there's another one that's going to happen at the end of March, if anybody is in California vicinity, in the Stanford vicinity. It's actually in Menlo Park this time, so it'll be a little closer to, very close to Stanford. And so the reason for that work, which is essentially the work that I'm now continuing on my own, is, as I said before, technology for climate is advancing with incredible rapidity in a way that I'm, in general, optimistic about. And, you know, I have other thoughts about the intersection of all this other tech that we spent the last 20 years obsessing over that led to these giant internet companies and the digital lifestyle we all lead, and how that affects where we go from here, particularly regarding climate.
are you, can you talk about how you're optimistic? I mean, the fundamental question for me is technology going to save our planet?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. I think that's a dangerous way to think, and I don't think most people would say yes. However, the way I look at technology is that it's essentially a lever to amplify human impact, right? And it can do so in innumerable ways, but you have to have intention, and you have to have a sense of ethics and understanding of the limitations of technology, and that's not easy to get. And obviously, people like Mark Zuckerberg lack that to some substantial degree. And as you didn't mention, I don't think that I wrote a book about Facebook, so I'm kind of a Facebook expert, whether I like it or not. And that's been very distressing. And it's a great case in point of how technology can go wrong, even as it's also still doing a lot of great things. But I do believe, those caveats out of the way, that there is an astonishing efflorescence of climate technology innovation underway right now in almost any arena you can imagine. The amount of money flowing into it is phenomenal. I have some of those statistics if you're interested in hearing them. And the creativity and sort of determination of the entrepreneurial community, which, you know, still to some large degree is centered around Silicon Valley and, you know, all emanating from your own Stanford campus, although a lot is happening, you know, MIT. There's an amazing company called Commonwealth Fusion Systems that came out of MIT, which is less than 5 years old and has raised $2 billion to create fusion nuclear power systems, which is still speculative because they've never really been shown to work. But the point is, that's a dramatic example, but there are literally thousands of companies and startups, but also an increasing percentage of large existing companies in a variety of industries, especially in software and technology, but not only, are themselves doing extremely ambitious things. Microsoft has set itself apart for some time. And you know, they're in climate tech in some sense. It's just that I mentioned them simply as an example of the incredible conviction to do the right thing as a large company, which is not always understood by many. There are a fair number of large companies that are quite determined, although few that are as determined as Microsoft. But I am optimistic that we can do it, you know, with itself having caveats. You know, will we be able to keep warming of the planet to 1.5 degrees as the Paris Accords contemplated? Almost certainly not. There is just too much evidence that we are already on a trajectory to take us beyond that point, given, you know, the continuing growth in global emissions. I mean, we have not really gotten our arms around the problem as a planet, as a society, and that's deeply disturbing and certainly has to leaven anyone's optimism. But I believe we can, in coming decades, take far more positive and effective actions than I think most people have up to now recognized. And technology will be absolutely indispensable to that. But technology will then lead to lifestyle changes that also have to be, you know, folded into that in a massive way. So technology will not save us, and I never say that. And and technology is just a neutral thing that people have to use. So it always comes down to the people. And what are people going to do? And we do need a collective epiphany of the urgency of this problem, and that hasn't yet really sufficiently happened, especially in the United States.
Let me just take you to the fossil fuel industry, because we see that they have record profits now, and yet many of them are moving away from renewables and green energy research. So what do you see in that world? Do you have contact with anyone in that field and any insight?
You know, that's not an area personal expertise, but I certainly read a lot and I have some sense of what's going on. And I am trying to get a book going, which would require me to really dive into that particular issue. Because really, this role of oil and gas and fossil fuels in the climate transition is probably the single most fraught topic. And it's coming to the fore in an interesting way right this moment, because COP28 is going to be in the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi. And the president of the COP is the head of the national oil company of UAE. He's also head of a massive green tech company called Masdar. And he says he absolutely is committed to reducing global warming, but he is drilling for and selling oil and gas at large quantities. So it's complicated. But, you know, even though it has been reported in the last few weeks in particular that Chevron, Exxon, BP, and others seem to be backing away a little bit from commitments they had previously made to sustainable energy development, there is still massive investment in those companies into sustainable energy in almost every case. I'm not familiar with every single company's efforts, but I mean, just to name one interesting example that I did stumble across the other day, Occidental Petroleum, which granted is one of the relatively smaller oil companies headquartered in Los Angeles, but it's not tiny. They have committed to spending $800 million to $1 billion on carbon capture as a business, just in one installation in Texas. And once they get that going, which of course it's never been done at that scale, they intend to build carbon capture systems in a number of other locations that would be comparably gigantic. So they're doing things. The thing, and I know you all have a lot of strong opinions about the fossil fuel industry, which is hard to disagree with. But we're going to need fossil fuels for a long time, more than the decade that Biden mentioned in his State of the Union, unfortunately. It's just the reality. We cannot get off them very quickly. And the other thing I was going to say, it's easy to hate them because of their long-term history of climate denial, which is unconscionable and improvable, particularly in the case of Exxon, but a number of the others as well. I mean, they deliberately tried to sabotage our efforts. There's no question. However, they also, many of them, are now trying to do a heck of a lot, and they're very wealthy. And because they're, the profits they got I think Exxon's profits in 2022 were the largest profits of any company in history. I forget the number, something like 55 billion in profit for 1 year. Unbelievable. So it's a very complicated topic, but I'll just finish on this by saying one of the most central reason that I feel completely confident in saying there is no way we can get off oil and gas and some even extent coal in any really near-term scenario is my concern about the less privileged of the world and there's still almost 2 billion people that don't even have a connection to the internet in the world today. There are many billions of people who live in countries which have been historically marginalized and kind of left behind in the modern industrial economy. And in almost every one of those countries, there is a very rapid shift in recent years towards development and towards improving the lifestyle of their billions of people. We have no right as Americans and wealthy people to tell them they don't have the right to develop, especially to tell them, no, you can develop, but you can't do it the way we are still doing, the way we did it and the way we are still doing it. And so, there's some, again, almost tautological problems in this arena. A good friend of mine, Vijay Vaiseswaran, is a writer at The Economist who recently wrote a piece, which the first sentence of said, India right now is constructing 39 coal plants, building new ones right now. However, Modi also says that he wants to be the world leader in sustainable energy. And India is investing a huge amount in solar, wind, batteries, etc. And the way somebody like Modi is forced to look at it, and I am no fan of Modi's, by the way, but even if he was not an autocrat and an anti-democratic figure, anyone in any of these countries has to be prepared to give their people the energy they need, regardless of its source to some extent. And that doesn't mean that many of those leaders don't recognize, as Modi does, that we need to make a transition to renewable and sustainable energy. But you can't tell the 400 million middle-class Indians that they can't turn on their power, their switch and get light, and as that number grows and more Indians go into the middle class, they're going to get energy any way they can. And this is complicated and to some extent, I think, controversial maybe in the United States. I don't think that many people think about it the way I just said, but to me, it's a very important aspect of the challenge we face.
Were you heartened by the resignation of the head of the World Bank? That was big news this week. He was considered to be a climate denier. And there's thinking that a new person might really change the way the World Bank works and the International Monetary Fund.
That change, of course, which I applaud, is kind of indicative of the reason why I am able to retain optimism that we can act before it's too late, even if it's 2 degrees instead of 1.5 degrees, and that we really can make enormous changes in the short term. I mean, remember, when Hillary and Trump debated in 2016, they had 3 debates. Climate was never even mentioned, never once mentioned in the presidential debates in the 2016 presidential election, which, I mean, I blame Hillary for that. But today, the head of the World Bank cannot be a climate denier because it is now at the forefront of the agenda of almost every country in the world, including China, to make a rapid switch to a sustainable planet out of fear, if nothing else. And so the fact that a climate denying Trump appointee has been essentially forced out of the World Bank, and it will certainly be replaced by a Biden appointee, since the US has this disproportionate influence in that institution, who is a committed climate activist, a financial activist, that's extremely positive. And, I mean, I got numbers up the wazoo to show how much money is flowing into this arena, and it needs to be more. And the World Bank and the IMF and, a lot of other forces have to be deployed to finance this extraordinary transition and especially given that the World Bank's role is lending money to those very countries I was just describing before.
Yeah. To bring you back from the big global picture to Stanford, many people in our group want to see Stanford disinvest in fossil fuels. And I think Yale has made steps in this direction, and Rockefeller University has. I'm just wondering, what do you think about that?
Well, I was afraid you might ask me that because I don't have a strong opinion. I certainly don't consider it the kind of thing that I would stake my time on as a major project. No offense. I think there's a lot more things that, like, for example, helping raise consciousness about this challenge we face with the developing world, and how are we going to get energy to several billion people who are entering the world's middle class in the next few decades. Or political activism in order to elect more political figures in our country and other countries that are committed, relentlessly to be working on climate. I don't oppose people who are concerned with divestment, but I don't think it's really my issue by any means. I see, the funny thing is, I was at Fortune magazine for 25 years, and I was practically a communist when I went in there. You may recall those days when I, kind of that sort of person, right? I have learned through close observation over those decades that business is no evil or non-evil force. It's like technology. Business is just a tool, right? And there are a huge number of business leaders who are really eager to do what's right for society. Unfortunately, they probably are still in the minority, but there are a lot of them. So I am not one to paint business with a broad brush in general, or even the fossil fuel industry. I think I would have to look at company by company, look at their exact behavior before I would have an opinion if I would accept money from them if I were doing something. I wonder why the Doerr School even needs their money if John Doerr gave them $1 billion. I mean, Jesus, you'd think they'd have enough to go for everything for the short term anyway. So, but the answer is, I'm ambivalent about it, as you can see, probably. I'm not an activist on that issue.
Well, that's really interesting, I think, for our group to hear. Are there any questions from people watching? I don't see a question in the chat box. Anybody wish to unmute?
We haven't had anybody put anything in the chat box, like you said, Meredith. But people do have the opportunity to unmute themselves if they would like to ask a question.
Or feel free to tell me you think I'm full of shit. I mean, I'm not opposed to being, argued with or told that I'm wrong. I mean, I'm figuring this out like everybody else. This is tough stuff. A lot of these issues, it's a lot harder and tougher than generally acknowledged, I would say, to figure out what really is the proper direction. I'll say another controversial thing. To some extent, it doesn't even matter what happens in the United States. The only way the world is going to make anything close to the targets of the Paris Accords is if all those countries, Peru, Bangladesh, Indonesia, wherever, Nigeria, South Africa, develop with sustainable energy. They're going to develop. If they don't have sustainable renewable energy, which many of them want, but at the moment, most of them aren't going as fast in that as we need, then there's no way we're even going to stay close to 2 degrees, because that is where emissions are growing. And we are sort of topping out a little bit here. I just think it's so easy for Americans, and you live in France, Meredith, it's so easy for Americans to be way overly US centric in their way of looking at every issue. And let's remember, there are more people in the middle class in India than there are Americans, So anyway, I'm just.
David, we do have a
Absolutely.
question from Yanai. Do you want to unmute yourself, Yanai? And
thanks, David, and hi everybody. I'm a new face. I'm one of the activists working for dissociation more than divestment, which I can explain a little bit more in a moment. But I held my tongue and stayed muted. But then, upon your invitation, David, your very kind invitation to speak up, if you just had a comment, I raised my hand. It's a long issue and we can discuss more, but I guess one thing I'll say, and I'll say it more in the context of the activism I'll switch my talk around a little bit to start with a pitch for why you should care about institutional divestment and dissociation both, but it's predicated, among other things, on an understanding of oil companies as being, far more unilaterally opposed to climate action than you suggest. And one specific part of that is carbon capture. I think you mentioned that in the context of Occidental sort of turning the ship around towards sustainability. And we can.
I didn't say that. I just said they're investing in carbon capture.
Sure.
I didn't say they're turning the ship around, and they do it partly for image and to they want to be able to say, hey, we're emitting over here, but we're sucking up over there. I know that.
Sure. And I guess, so my perspective, especially having spoken to a professor of petroleum engineering, Jeff Kers here at Stanford, who knows this issue much better than I do, is that, carbon capture for power generation is, without caveats, complete greenwashing and a waste of time and money and just a way to get federal benefits. He does see some benefit in carbon capture and storage for cement manufacture and maybe some steel. But when it comes to putting it on power plants, and that also just has to do with the cost, right? Versus retiring the plants entirely. But I just wanted to throw that out there. I'm the messenger, but coming from a professor of petroleum engineering here at Stanford.
No, I can't deny. I have plenty to learn about this. I'm an expert on Facebook, right? Who's decided that technology and climate is my issue. I'm not going to take a strong stand on divestment or not, or whatever you want to call it. But I do think that in every discussion of business, nuance is generally absent in American politics and dialogue. So I try to bring a little nuance to it as someone who knows a lot of business leaders and actually is intrinsically skeptical of them.
Thanks. And thanks again for the invitation.
I'm heartened that you feel that there is a significant cohort who want to do the right thing and have some ethical values, that it's not just about the company profit. And that's your experience, is it?
Well, it's not only that. one of the things that's been much remarked upon in business in recent years is that you can't hire good young people unless your company at least pretends to do the right thing. Young people don't want to go work for Exxon if it's a climate denier, or Johnson & Johnson if it's, putting asbestos in baby powder or whatever. People want to work for companies they can feel good about, and that is almost universal among the talented young people of the entire planet who are educated. So these leaders, even if they are, reprobate dinosaurs themselves, their self-interest in many cases forces them to start doing things differently, or else they're going to basically lose the talent race among many other forces that are affecting them.
That's really interesting. And I hope you can help the Stanford law students. They've got a group that are climate conscious, and they want to find internships with companies that are forward looking and will mentor them onward. And that's the kind of company they want to work in. And one of the things we're trying to do as a group is to figure out how can we help these Stanford students get placed in the right places.
That sounds great. I'll say one quick thing. The software industry is really in the forefront in many cases of this issue, partly because they're so rich anyway, but also because many of them are consumer companies. They recognize they have to be seen to be doing the right thing. But it's no coincidence that it's not just to save money that Facebook, Meta, Apple, Amazon locate their data centers near hydropower. It's partly and are investing in some cases gigantic amounts in green energy. Google has done that. They're trying, they want to do the right. Those companies have pretty much all had the epiphany. I think there's plenty of other companies in other industries where it's much more nascent.
We do have another question from Dana.
And
You want to unmute yourself?
Okay.
Yeah, hi. I'm Dana calling in from Finland. I run the Environment and Climate Crisis Council for Democrats Abroad, and have been a part of a group really looking at this problem from where we are experiencing it all over the world. I've been involved with several of the COP meetings, and I want to address your issue, what you said about energy companies not being equal, because they are not. And there are some that are really egregious offenders, and others, well, they're all egregious offenders, but some do, yes, invest in carbon capture, try to diversify their investments in alternative energy, try to look at how they can transition stranded assets to geothermal and other technologies, and recognize that these fossil fuels need to be and will be phased out. I think we can all agree we have to get off of fossil fuels. This is a no-brainer. We understand science. But I think that in discussions in our steering committee about what we want to stand for as an alumni group, apparently we are precluded from becoming an official alumni, Stanford alumni group, if in our terms of reference, we are overtly calling for the divestment from fossil fuels. There's so many things that we can advocate for, and still have a seat at the table without making that the central issue. So I think that's one of the reasons this question has come up. There's so many ways to be an activist, to move the conversation forward, and to help us really solve this problem. So I'm not
Thank
sure
you.
there's really a question in there, just an agreement and an extrapolation.
Found it interesting, and I kind of agree with what you said, obviously.
David, before we finish, because I know you have to get on, do you want to say something? I'm looking at the Techonomy Climate Conference, March 28th. And I see you've got Bill McKibben, who is the founder of Third Act and 305.org. And a woman, I don't know her, she's the chief sustainability officer at Microsoft, and a former senior director of climate and energy at the National Security Council in the White House, among the speakers. Who goes to these conferences and what do they accomplish?
Well, first of all, I'm not any longer organizing that, but I did get a lot of those speakers coming. Those two I didn't, but we have a lot of great speakers coming that I did recruit before I left at the end of the year for that conference. But, you know, we had a Techonomy Climate Conference last year, which is analogous. The audience, I was really surprised last year at this conference in Mountain View, what a large number of venture capitalists were there. This is a fad almost in venture capital. In fact, there's a statistic I have in front of me. About 1/4 of all venture investment in 2022 went to climate tech, according to, I think, PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC. You know, venture investment in climate tech was 70 billion globally in 2022. So the VCs, they see dollar signs, which is not a bad thing. And they are flocking to these kinds of events, especially Techonomy's often had a very Silicon Valley community orientation, which includes a lot of investors and entrepreneurs and company employees and executives. But the interest in this is pretty darn widespread. And Techonomy is capitalizing on that too.
And can you join by Zoom to attend it? It didn't look like it
Yes.
from what I saw online.
Well, I'm not positive. Like I said, I'm not there anymore. But we certainly, last year you could. I'm pretty sure there will be a live stream version of it. There generally is. I would be very surprised if there wasn't. But, you know, I just have to say, you know, I was so intrigued by what Dana said, you know, if all the issues that there are, I think this issue that I'm talking about, that Americans so completely get wrong about responsibility that we have to help the poor people of the world get energy, ideally green energy, that is to me one of the central issues there is. And it's, you know, and as you may recall, I lived in Nigeria as a child, so I have a little bit of a global view from that possibly, but you know, I think that kind of thing, Americans are so blind to the fundamental realities of the climate challenge, I think, and in particularly in that one respect. So I wanted to reiterate that.
Thank you. Is there anything else you want to say, David, that we didn't get onto that as a final thought?
Well, it's funny, I was talking to somebody this morning. Another interesting point that I didn't mention is one of the reasons for my optimism, which again, Stanford's in the thick of it, for better or for worse. You know, all the innovations of the internet age, whether it's AI or cloud computing or 5G, you know, wireless, or, you know, I would probably not include cryptocurrency, but, you know, almost all of the major innovations, these are things that are so far along and are so transformational for the conduct of business generally, and are still, for the most part, underutilized in business. They are setting the foundation for much more rapid climate action, at least in theory, because they exist. They can be utilized in incredibly creative ways. I mean, generative artificial intelligence, for example, you can design buildings, you know, by just telling what to do. You know, we're going to have a lot of speed, potential to do things quickly in every industry, but especially important to me is how that will affect climate action and the building of a electrical emissions-free infrastructure, which we have to do so urgently. It can be done much more rapidly than most people recognize. And one good reason is all of this infrastructure that the internet age brought to us.
With that, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. And
Thank you for having me.
and feel
Hope I
free to
didn't
hang
offend you.
around if you want to listen on.
I may hang
Bill?
around a little bit.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. David, thank you very much. This is great. And let me get you out of the spotlight if I can do that. In which case now we got our Hollywood Squares back. Wanted to introduce you to Unai, who you met already, and Unai and June. Gotta find, you're here somewhere here. There we go. See if I can spotlight the two of you. And all right, and Yanai, what I wanted to do was I had asked June and Yanai to give a little bit of a better discussion about the work that they're doing with the coalition. It's better to have some faces with the names. So with that, let me turn it over to you and give sort of what you can about the coalition.
Thanks, Bill. Hi, June. I don't know how you want to do this. We can interleave slides, or but before we jump in, I'll just want to say, as is probably evidenced by the fact we're spending quite a lot of our free time agitating for institutional divestment, and well, mostly dissociation, meaning research fund ending of research funding, but also divestment. We do see it as a pretty important issue, and happy to talk a little bit more about the why there.
Yeah, I think we can go through slides. Yana, did you all already introduce like what you're doing at Stanford, all of that?
Oh, me personally, in terms of research?
Yeah, I think maybe it would help. I don't know if you've already done it. That's why. So we could say 2 sentences before blowing through the slides and then maybe say a bit more after.
Works for me. June, you want to take it away?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. I'm very grateful to Bill for having been such an active alum participant in our coalition meetings. We meet bi-weekly. Basically, sometime starting last summer, we've started to do the bi-weekly. I'm a second-year PhD student in Earth System Science. I work with climate scientists Noah Diffenbaugh and Marshall Burke. I focus on quantifying disproportionate impacts of extreme climate events and increasingly more on quantifying the adaptation response, starting with response to flooding. Yanai?
Yeah, hi, everyone. Thanks again to, Bill. Bill has been a great member and participant in our meetings and action. So I'm a PhD student in Rob Jackson's lab here at Stanford, studying indoor air quality, and in particular, this part of my research has been on gas stove pollution. So kind of blown up recently, but I started it before all the brouhaha, and sort of both on sort of climate and health impacts of fossil fuels in the home, which in most cases ends up being natural gas in the home. So I can share slides. Okay. Can everybody see okay? Great.
Yep.
June, I did the talking last time at David's class. Do you want to do the talking? Otherwise, I'm happy to.
Oh, I think you're familiar with the ordering, so you should go ahead.
But please jump in.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're the Coalition for a True School of Sustainability. I gather Bill has shared a little bit about what we do. There we go. So we formed last May when the new Door School was announced, and in particular in response to our Dean Arun Majumdar's statement to the New York Times that the school would be open to collaborating with and accepting money from fossil fuel companies. We, this despite $1.1 billion from John Doerr and then another $600 million from mostly tech money that was mostly fossil fuel free. So it got quite an influx of money. And, this is an interesting question, I think, especially given the previous speaker's lack of interest in this kind of activism. One thing, one reason that we exist is because fossil fuel investments through the endowment are one problem, but we're actually mostly focused not on the endowment, but on direct research funding by fossil fuel companies. So this comes in the form of annual membership dues to industry affiliate programs, also through one-on-one research contracts with individual faculty members. And we don't have total numbers on this money. A lot of it is very opaque, but the floor is right around, say $14-15 million, but it could be even an order of magnitude higher than that per year. And these affiliate programs research, things that are very straightforwardly about exploration and extraction. I mean, there's the Stanford Exploration Project, which developed an algorithm recently that helped BP find 200 million barrels of new oil in the Gulf. And then there's also sort of gray zone projects on things like carbon capture. There are a few projects that are more straightforwardly green, which are often the ones cherry picked as examples. But when fossil fuel companies fund these research programs, in a lot of cases they actually get seats on the advisory boards of these affiliate programs, and then have power to shape the research agenda. And there's also a lot of soft influence, recruiting opportunities, and there's quite a lot of research now that shows it can bias individual studies and the research agenda in general in favor of fossil fuels. Of course, they also can tout it to bolster their green credentials and use it for lobbying and for greenwashing. June, any more comments on the why for now?
We can let's go through the end.
Yeah, sure. So we've got a bunch of more specific demands, but the gist is committing to an open and transparent process to assess industry-funded research, and making sure that process is based on quantifiable Paris-aligned criteria that are very specific, and then to phase out institutional funding from partners that do not meet that criteria. We have several different prongs. We've got sort of the back end strategy talking to school admin. We also have a lot of public facing actions and also education. So coming up, we've got a former professor of petroleum engineering who will be speaking about his decision not to take fossil fuel money anymore on February 24th. That is there. And then we are just the Stanford chapter of an international organization called Fossil Free Research, which is basically tries to coordinate among now dozens of different campuses all across the world, trying to divest and dissociate from fossil fuel companies. All right, I think those are our slides, so we can chat a little bit. Let's stop sharing.
Yeah.
Do we have questions for people? Or June, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, just before we go into the questions, I would just like to underscore where our progress is right now. So basically, Stanford has launched a faculty committee to investigate fossil funding ties, and this has been established at the university level. So it's beyond the Doors School and beyond Dean's jurisdiction. And that committee is a very high level committee consisting of GSB, current dean, and former law school dean Paul Brest, and dean of humanities sciences Deborah Satz, together with Paul Brest are co-chairing this. And a lot of their process have not been public, but we're trying to feed into that process as much as possible. And in parallel, there are also efforts to put together a deliberative democracy process put together by the Stanford Democracy Project Lab. And right now there's a lot of strategic thinking, because the committee represents one opportunity for our demands to be heard, but thinking about how to carefully craft those demands, because we're hearing that the committee is not really open to hearing the action-oriented language, but rather the philosophical underpinnings of where we stand. So just wanted to add that these are some recent developments, and we can take some questions.
We've got one question that's queued up. Naomi, why don't you unmute yourself?
Yeah, it's more of a comment for discussion. When you talk about what you're doing and what the university is doing, I find it really analogous to medical scientific research and the pharmaceutical industry, which is more my background. And my family was at Rockefeller, and And you could see the direction of research being so influenced by the pharmaceutical money and backing, and that academia was not supporting as much. And I just think, I don't know how much you've looked at that analogy and what you can possibly do, but when I listen to you, it's like, oh yeah, this is exactly what pharma has done to medical research.
Yeah. And I just first thoughts on that is some of the responses that we've gotten, I think people acknowledge that there's this analogy there, but then usually immediately it's turned back into, well, our energy system is fossil fuel dependent. And so we have to work with these big actors because they have the infrastructure and resources to change the energy, like to affect the energy transition. So it's usually that piece about the research integrity piece is almost like, oh, maybe, but we have conflict of interest policies in place and we must act with these. So the collaboration piece becomes like the fixation point. And it's like, okay, we're less worried about the research integrity. It almost feels like, Yanai, how have you felt?
Yeah, I don't quite know what to make of it, but because it's sort of presumptuous to call some of these university leaders naive, me being all of 24, but I will say that's sometimes how it feels, because a lot of the narratives around this allows us to have a seat at the table with these big companies with all these resources, and look, they're doing carbon capture, and look, they're doing hydrogen, and what other company has these resources to affect the kind of transition we need at the pace we need. So I maybe I'm missing something, but my sense is the reality on the ground is 8 of the 10 largest photovoltaics companies have nothing to do at all with fossil fuels, so we don't really need them to scale that up quickly. And as June was saying, there's not really any evidence that having the seat at the table is actually affecting their actions. We have a little document we made with sort of analogies that may or may not land, but one which we have is universities partnered with Purdue Pharma on addiction prevention work, and by having a seat at the table, we're able to successfully avoid the opioid epidemic. Like, you apply that logic to other cases, and it seems crazy.
I mean, the other thing one thing that I experienced personally in my work was the pharmaceutical industry in their influence in Alzheimer's research. And there was a point, 18, 20 years ago where everybody was doing research on NSAIDs because that's a perfect place for pharma. Oh, we already have NSAIDs, and wow, if we can, if it's useful for Alzheimer's disease, that's great for us. And so there's so many clear examples of how one has to be careful about the integrity of the research that's being done and how it's being influenced by money, where like fossil fuel industry, where they've got a vested interest in going in one direction that maybe basic research says, well, maybe we should look in the other direction as well.
I have to jump in here for a couple of reasons. There's one last question, Chris, if you want to unmute yourself, and then we do need to get on to Mark to advocate for dissociation and divestment for the CalSPERS. Chris, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. So I come from an activist background. You're not naive, Yanni. We're just too comfortable in the paradigms that we have, including the structural ones. So my first question is to build on a couple in the chat. Are you wish to participate in the Fossil Free Stanford Alumni Group? I'm glad that you enumerated more details about where it's going. To what extent have the alums from that fossil free effort been addressed? And maybe not at this meeting, but at another one. I did sign up for the respective TRUE coalition. I'll be at the 24th meeting. I need to get the word out to people I know. And so just the focus on that coalition becoming strengthened by the previous ones of us who had been working on the divestment is the point I want you to think about with us. And then lastly, being at the table is not good enough. We need a new table. And that's what I think, really have to be aggressive about. Apologize to anybody for whom that's uncomfortable, but that is where we need to be.
June, any sort of closing comments? Again, you've helped me put the names to faces to names to the comments. And I think, Chris, in terms of getting more alumni involvement, I think that's been certainly achieved. June?
I would I think my final thoughts on this is the all hands on deck approach definitely does not work here. Completely agree. We need to completely shift the paradigm that these faculty are thinking about. But it's just been so comedic sometimes at the level at which faculty just refuse to do the mind shift change. They're just so convinced that this collaboration is the only way to really affect the energy transition, and then just close their minds on the evidence about how current action actually delays climate action and promotes false optimism in all these technologies. With Exxon just pulling up from green algae, that's like a prime example. And so, yeah, I think we just have to really focus on the integrity piece and accountability piece for a university, because even the current conflict of interest policies are being violated, and we're also trying to point those out specifically.
Thanks, June. I know you have to get to Park. I can't resist one last closing comment, if you will, Bill.
Yeah.
I think that it is important to remember, and probably this is not news to folks in this room, the fact that oil companies have given up on climate denial does not mean they're turning the ship around. It means that it's stopped working for them, and they've gone on to more subtle and effective methods of climate delay. Chief among them is promoting, I'm going to go ahead and say, fake solutions that can require continued burning of hydrocarbons dug up from the ground, that have a high marginal cost, so keep people hooked in a way that free photons from the sun do not, and that at this point have a lot of government benefits. So it's really important to ask, what do you mean by sustainability when you have an example of an oil company doing something quote unquote sustainable?
Well, with that, I'm going to turn you two loose, because I know you had a lot going on today. And it actually, I think it sets up pretty well for Park, for you to see if I can unpin you. There we go. And Park, why don't you, I'm going to switch to the speaker mode for everybody. Why don't you go ahead and introduce to everybody what you've been doing, because it seems to fit as a good continuity to this.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Yanai and June, thanks so much for your all's work. It's really fascinating hearing you talk about it. I'm seeing exactly the same patterns with the public pension divestment in terms of kind of adherence to the status quo paradigms and narratives. And there being lots of institutional resistance to kind of fully perceiving the level of misinformation coming out of the fossil fuel industry. So that was really refreshing. Thank you. And thank you everyone for having me on. My name's Park Guthrie. I graduated in '92. And for most of my career since then, I've been a public school teacher in California. Bill, can I do share screen?
Yep, it's yours.
Great. Let's see. I dropped a link. Are you able to see the Google Doc?
Yep, that shows
Okay.
up.
I dropped a link to this Google Doc, and I thought this was just fun. I went to my 30th reunion in November and happened to join a true protest in front of the opening of the Door Sustainability School. So I'm the old guy on the left in that picture. And I just wanted to talk about the SB 252, which was it's divestment legislation that was just introduced by Senator Lena Gonzalez, California State Senator. And she introduced a very similar bill last year, and it would require fossil fuel divestment of California public pensions, CalPERS, and also CalSTRS. CalPERS is mostly public employees, and most of CalSTRS is teachers. And I will be a CalSTRS beneficiary when I retire. And combined, I believe these two are the biggest public pension in the world. So they've got I think combined over $700 billion worth of investments. And there on this link, I included a fact sheet about the Fossil Fuel Divestment Act. And then there are sign-ons for both organizations and individuals can also sign on using a link here. And the Fossil Fuel Divestment Act is similar to ones that Maine passed, and which would exclude the top oil producers from CalPERS and CalSTRS investments. And then this is an issue I've been working on for a number of years, and I've done a lot of research in the bias and misinformation about CalSTRS, CalPERS, fossil fuel divestment. And it just sort of started as a curious CTA member trying to understand why my union, why at the state level, the state council of the CTA, why we weren't speaking up for fossil fuel divestment the way that the smaller California Federation of Teachers did, and the way many educators unions have. The California State Professors Unions have come out for fossil fuel divestment. You probably know that the entire UC system has divested. So I was kind of like, wow, I'm a teacher, and for me it's especially poignant. I teach in Sonoma County, so since 2017, my students and my own children, we've been evacuated 3 times. We've had school closed, I think 7 times due to climate-related disasters, twice flooding, and 5 times due to fires. So it's a really it comes to a point. I've got 6th graders, and it's curious why my teachers union would be the one protecting the social license of the industry that has organized climate neglect. And so what I found was, basically, my union has been misled by the financial executives at CalSTRS. And again, I don't think it's anyone's, they don't wake up and say, oh, how can I deceive the teachers to protect the fossil fuel industry? But there's status quo bias, and there's institutional inertia, and to be honest, a certain level of sort of institutional arrogance that makes it comfortable to mislead the teachers. So I just want to quickly, the textbook example of this is from 2017, when California considered a fossil fuel divestment bill. And basically, it was the Dakota Access Pipeline divestment bill that was considered it was introduced in 2016, and the Standing Rock Nation asked for all investors to help prevent the Dakota Access Pipeline, and Senator Ash Kalra from San Jose introduced the divestment bill. But in 2017, April 3rd, the CTA took a position against this bill and sent this letter to Ash Kalra saying, we must oppose your bill. And so then the big question was, well, why didn't we support the Standing Rock Sioux tribe? And the reason given in the letter was that, quote, CalSTRS estimated that this bill might cost $8 billion. And so we really support your cause, it says in the letter, but we just cannot due to financial concerns. So that was the letter sent to Ash Kalra. 2 weeks later, he stripped divestment from his own bill, and a very, very much weakened bill passed that only had engagement and no divestment. So the CTA letter was very, very significant and had a big impact. And so, in 2021, I was like, $8 billion seems really, really high. I just want to see the numbers behind that. And I sent a letter, did a public records request, and it turns out CalSTRS wouldn't stand by that number as an estimate. CalSTRS says they didn't make that claim. It turns out the CTA staffer who wrote that letter was a former CalSTRS executive. And essentially, I think she just took license and said, well, there's 8 billion in all of the companies. So the exposure is 8 billion. And we're just going to say that's a reasonable estimate of potential loss. And that is a really, really chilling piece of misinformation because it's absolutely not accurate. The assumption would be that you might end up just burning the $8 billion and you wouldn't reinvest it. And as a matter of fact, backwards looking analysis shows that by not divesting, because we didn't divest, we likely lost significant amounts of money. So in 2021, a CalSTRS staffer correctly identified this and said, at first glance. So it was very quick and easy for a non-lay person to look at this letter and realize there's a gross misunderstanding. The CTA overstated potential cost by a factor of 270 to 10,000. And that was the understanding that CTA state council members had. And so that accounts for why, my union took a stand against fossil fuel divestment. And the tale is, kind of more shocking. I did a public records ask and found out that both the chief executive officer and the chief information officer chief investment officer at CalSTRS, Chris Ailman and Jack Enos, actually received a copy of the letter before Assemblymember Kalra stripped divestment from his bill. And, there's never, and they were silent. CalSTRS board, it's an open secret that this happened. They're fully aware that this level of misinformation happened. And there's never been any attempt to even correct the record or make amends. And, this is kind of the most cut and dry example of misinformation, but it continues to this day. Last year, a CalSTRS executive told the CTA State Council that the divestment bill might cost $20 billion. And I actually have a meeting this afternoon. I've been asking for the assumptions, for the spreadsheets they use to calculate that number. I've been asking for that for 9 months and haven't been able to get it yet. So anyhow, there's a whole lot there. I know I've talked a lot. I'll stop. And if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer.
Great. Park, thank you very much. That was very informative and interesting. You can hear my dogs in the background. Like people are coming. Any quick questions? Because we have gone over time, but it's very important. Anybody that wants to do that while I mute the dogs? I think that what you have presented and what June and Yanai presented and what David was talking about, there's a common theme of so much of this. I think if there's anything that I've run into and what I'm doing is misinformation. It's pervasive. I'm working a lot on offshore wind, and it's interesting the misinformation that is being spread by environmentalists about offshore wind, and it's pervasive. Anyway, if there are no questions, I'll just give one quick little update on what we've been doing at SACA. And we've had a steering committee meeting and we adopted bylaws that include three membership categories: alumni, students, and friends. We established the steering committee and opportunities for other committees. We did guidelines for events and activities. We also had circulated a questionnaire. Unfortunately, we only got 36 respondents out of 230 invitations. So if you received a questionnaire or you know anybody that did, encourage them to respond. But it does show in those 36 respondents, we have an incredible diversity of experience and skills and all. That then leads me into the last part, which is we have a great need for more members on our steering committee. And so having those people that can join us in that capacity would be great. The last little thing I mentioned is past and upcoming events. Many of you participated in the Kim Stanley Robinson talk, and Stan was very nice to have responded to everybody's question. And if you followed on that, if you didn't get those responses, please let me know. We're planning a bunch of other events. I have a feeling that we're going to need to do much longer monthly meetings, or better yet, we'll have specific events. So we do need help with planning, with events, with other things. So if you can participate, and if you can let other people know how they can participate, we need all the help we can get. Now, with that little rush thing, I want to thank Park for your contribution, for June and Yanai for your talk. And I think that David may still be on the phone, on his phone. In any case, everybody did a great job. I think this is probably far and away the most productive and useful meeting we have had so far. So unless anybody has any other comments, closing comments, I'm going to stop the recording